The most popular word in Old English is the interrogative Hwæt. While it literally means what, it can be used in pretty unique ways, especially in poetry, and most iconically in Beowulf, which begins with the word in big letters, Hwæt. A commonly told fun fact about this word is that it was an interjection, something shouted, a sort of call to attention that the poet would exclaim at the beginning of the poem. You can find this everywhere. In respected dictionaries like Bosworth-Taller, it's listed as an interjection. In most Old English textbooks, it's glossed and explained as an interjection. In most translations of Beowulf, it's rendered really creatively as lo, listen, hark, so by Seamus Heaney, and even bro by Maria Headley. And the reason for its popularity is really easy to understand. It's a very clear, vivid image that allows you to put yourself in an Anglo-Saxon hall and hear the voice of the Shope cut through the sounds of mirth and merriment to tell you, be silent, be still, listen to the story I'm going to tell you. So, it is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that this is almost certainly completely wrong. It's a total fiction. There's a really common tendency in academia for someone to come up with an idea, and that idea checks just enough boxes that it's a convenient enough solution and no one really questions it. The reason why it's important to have a healthy dose of skepticism, then, is that sometimes when you do question established consensus, you might discover serious problems that just haven't been unearthed yet because no one has looked at it from that angle before. I'm aware that this is not going to be my most popular video. The idea that Hwæt is an interjection and the image of the poet shouting it at the beginning of the poem is genuinely popular. It makes people happy. And so I'm kind of raining on everyone's parade here. I ask you then, as the viewer, to be patient and open-minded and to fairly consider the evidence that I'm going to lay out before you today. I'm going to show you today that using recent syntactic scholarship, most notably by Constance professor George Walkden, we can demonstrate with very high confidence that Hwæt was not an interjection in Old English. Stay tuned. How would you define an interjection? Merriam-Webster calls it an utterance usually lacking grammatical connection, meaning that if I say something like, "Good heavens, you've grown," or "Damn, that's crazy," in both of those instances, I can say "you've grown" and "that's crazy," and the sentence still works. But if I add the interjection to the beginning, it just kind of adds a bit of oomph to it. We can see this pretty easily in modern English. Common interjections today are swear words, religious exclamatives, and sort of vocative nouns like bro or girl. Again, what makes these words special is that you can take them out without changing the grammatical meaning of the sentence. If you said, "Bro, your boots are on fire," the bro is kind of unnecessary, but the latter 5 words are all completely necessary to the meaning of the sentence. You can't change their order or take any of them out. If you change the order and say, "Bro, your boots fire are on," that doesn't make any sense. If you take out the preposition and say, "Bro, your boots are fire," that's a completely different sentence. If you take out the interjection, though, and just say, "Your boots are on fire," it has the exact same meaning. It's very important to remember this for later on in the video. An interjection is not grammatically connected to the sentence. That's what we think an interjection is, but what did the Old English think about interjections? Well, we actually kind of know. The monk, Alfred of Ancient, actually wrote a grammar of Latin in Old English. Parts of it are just translations of earlier Latin models, but a good majority of it is his own elaboration and explanation of grammatical concepts. Alfred emphasizes, as we would expect, that interjections convey "thas modus gewilnunge," the sort of desires of the mind, that is, emotion. He gives a list of Latin interjections and a parallel list of Old English interjections as he goes, including things like alla, walla, wella, well, hui, and others. Now, Latin has an attention-grabbing interjection. It's ecce, and Alfred glosses it, but not with Hwæt. He uses evne nu, which is a really common interjection in Old English, meaning sort of, "look here." In fact, in the nearly 800 times that ecce is mentioned somewhere in an Old English text or gloss, it's never translated as Hwæt, and Alfred doesn't even mention this interjection at all in his grammar. That's not definitive evidence, but it's definitely strange. If Hwæt is this attention-grabbing interjection, wouldn't we expect to see it gloss ecce at least once in 800 times? Wouldn't we expect to see it in the list of interjections that Alfred gives us? If Aldrich doesn't tell us that Hwæt is an interjection, where do we get the idea from? The most quoted definition of Hwæt was that it was an emphatic word calling the audience's attention to the recitation to follow. This is the stance of the extremely respected philologists Bruce Mitchell and Fred Robinson in their 1964 textbook, A Guide to Old English. But the idea was actually first promulgated by Jakob Grimm. Yes, one of the brothers Grimm. They were actually great philologists. And he analyzed it as ein bloßer Ausruf, that is, a mere interjection. Now, I think that conclusion is inaccurate, but the evidence that led him to that conclusion is very real. Hwæt is definitely a strange word. Let's look at this sentence here. Here is a random line from Psalm 139, line 10. Hwæt me thine hond thidder ladeth. Some editors will punctuate this line by having a comma or an exclamation mark after Hwæt, but let's put ourselves in the shoes of Jakob Grimm, looking at an unpunctuated manuscript and trying to figure out what it means. We know that the sentence means, your hand leads me there. Me means me, thine means your, hond means hand, thidder means to there or thither, and then ladeth means leads. Your hand leads me there. So what on earth is Hwæt doing at the beginning of the sentence? At first, it's not easy to explain, and that's why some people interpret it as an interjection. They'll add a comma or an exclamation mark after Hwæt with the intended meaning of like, oh, your hand leads me there. Now, the first problem with this is that we know exactly what the translator was trying to say because we have the Latin that he was working with. Etenem, illuc manus tua deducet me. Here we can see that the translator is using Hwæt to translate this word etenem, which isn't an interjection, it's a conjunction, meaning something like indeed or truly. Now, that's also not definitive evidence because the translator is clearly very comfortable here to use natural Old English. That is, he's not following the Latin word for word, he's phrasing this exactly how he feels it should be phrased. Still, if Hwæt were an interjection, we would expect it to gloss interjections, not conjunctions. I've looked pretty thoroughly, and please fact check me on this, but I can't find a single example in the entire corpus of Hwæt glossing an interjection. They're all words like this, etenem, a sort of meaningless filler conjunction. A bigger issue, and this is where George Walkden's research comes in, is the way the sentence is phrased. As I just said, the Old English Psalm translator seems pretty comfortable using his own language. If he wanted to translate the Latin word for word, he would have just said, thidder hond thine ladeth me. That's the actual word for word Old English translation of the Latin, and sometimes that is how they do things, but not here. This is pretty natural Old English. But it's also not normal. The normal way to say your hand leads me there in Old English is actually the same way that you would say it in modern English. Thine hond ladeth me thidder. That's because modern English and Old English are both what's called subject-verb-object languages, meaning that you say things like, I walked the dog. I is the subject, walked is the verb, the dog is the object. It has to go in that order, or else the listener gets confused. You can't say things like, I the dog walked. That doesn't make any sense. Old English is a little looser than modern English when it comes to word order, so it also wouldn't be weird to see something like thine hond me ladeth thidder, that is, me coming before the verb. With personal pronouns, that kind of thing is sort of common. Neither of these ways are how the translator chose to write the sentence, though. He wrote, Hwæt me thine hond thidder ladeth, pushing the verb all the way to the end of the clause. That is weird. Verb final constructions do happen in Old English, but they usually happen in subordinate clauses. This isn't a subordinate clause. So why would the translator say it like that? He's not mimicking the Latin, so we can't blame that. It's not a subordinate clause. He just seems to instinctively put the verb at the end. Is it because of this word Hwæt? Let's take a random Old English text, The Lives of Saints, written by Aldrich. It's a great target for analysis because it's pretty long, it's written in very natural Old English, and it's written right at the end of the 10th century where we have the largest volume of Old English text to compare it with. That means that we can be pretty confident in it as an object of investigation. In the Lives of Saints, there are 9,920 clauses. 112 of them begin with Hwæt. As we've just said, in Old English, the normal word order is to have the verb after the subject and before the object. In subordinate clauses, it's more common to see what's called a V later construction, which is where the verb gets pushed later on in the sentence. The Psalm passage that we just looked at is a V later construction. Of the 4,173 root clauses, so normal non-subordinate clauses in the Lives of Saints, 77% of them have the verb immediately following the subject. So that's pretty normal. That demonstrates that that's normative word order. Of the Hwæt clauses, though, it's not 77%, it's not even a majority, it's less than half. Take a look at this chart that Professor Walkden draws up in his paper on the subject. As you can see, there's a really strange tendency for Hwæt to push the verb later on down in the clause, much more frequently than is normal. We even see this in the first sentence of Beowulf. Hwæt we gar deina jar darum theod kuniga thrymje frunon. Yefrunon, the verb, gets pushed all the way to the end. This kind of verb final construction is a lot more common in Beowulf as an older poem, but we still see sentences like that was god kuning, which demonstrate that the normative word order was still subject, verb, object. So this is still worth considering. Okay, before we throw everything out though and say that Hwæt isn't an interjection, we need to come up with a competing hypothesis. At its core, Hwæt is the interrogative pronoun. It's the same as Spanish que, Latin quid, German was, etc. The German example is really interesting. In German, you can say something like was du dich verändert hast, which means you have really changed. We can do the same thing in English with how, as in how you've changed. But we can also do it with what, most famously when Little Red Riding Hood asks the wolf, what big teeth you have. She's not asking which teeth the wolf has or what kind of teeth. She's just saying, you have really big teeth. And she's using the word what as an exclamative, which is an adverb that carries a sort of degree or scale sense. You'll notice as well that the sentence is, what big teeth you have. In English, you can't say big teeth you have. There's a reason why characters like Yoda sound weird when they do that. It's because you need a reason, a grammatical reason, to put the verb at the end of the clause. Here, because you're using an exclamative adverb, the verb gets pushed to the end of the clause, which is exactly what we see in the Psalms. Hwæt me thine hand thither ladeth. How your hand leads me there. It's harder to understand this in modern English because our word order has gotten so rigid. As you can see, for some reason, how actually doesn't have the ability to push the verb to the end of the sentence, even though it's an exclamative adverb. A better way to see how we differentiate between these adverbs and interjections is actually by using punctuation. Take a look at the difference between these two sentences. Now, I want you to remember what we said at the beginning of the video. An interjection is not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. But if a word is affecting the grammatical meaning or word order of a sentence, then it is grammatically connected. Wow is an interjection, so we separate it with a comma. You can take that out or put it in and it doesn't change the grammatical meaning of the sentence. How, as an exclamative adverb, is grammatically connected to the sentence, so we don't separate it with a comma. You can't take it out and have the same meaning. With that in mind, the other evidence starts to look really incriminating. What are the Latin words that Hwæt actually glosses? Etenim, verum autem, atvero. These aren't interjections, they're just conjunction filler words that help move a conversation along. Even if we took all the instances where Hwæt doesn't change the word order in a clause and interpreted those as having an other meaning, the logical contextual assumption should be that they are these sort of filler conjunctions, meaning like honestly or really, not some sort of flashy interjection. If you've made it this far into the video and you're still not convinced, then I'm going to assume that you are very, very interested in proving me wrong. And if you are, and you're somewhat well educated, you might know that in Shakespeare, this word, what, is an interjection. That is, in and around Shakespeare's time, we have unambiguous examples of what being shouted as an interjection. Things like what hey, what ho. This was probably the #1 motivating factor that led scholars like Jakob Grimm and Bruce Mitchell to thinking, okay, this word is probably some sort of interjection because it's already an interjection in the English language. But there is a problem with this line of reasoning, and I'll quote J.R.R. Tolkien. Etymology is not a safe guide to sense. Case in point, we don't say what as an interjection anymore. The language changed. It fell out of use. And if it can fall out of use, that means it can fall into use. Tolkien's quote is referring to the Old English word rad, which is where we get the word road from. But rad doesn't mean road. It means a riding. It can even mean an armed incursion, which is where we get the word raid from Scots. So if you went to early medieval England and you went into the middle of a square and said, Evne, rad, you would probably send people screaming because they don't think you're saying, look, a road. They would think you're saying, look, a raid is coming. And they would run around in circles and then probably arrest you for causing false panic. And as you sit in jail, all you have to say to yourself is, I shouldn't have used etymology as a guide to sense. This is why we need a healthy level of skepticism when we're interpreting words in Old English based on what they come to mean later on in the language. It's not enough to have an unambiguous example of an interjection in Shakespeare. You need an unambiguous example of an interjection in Old English, and that is something that we just don't have. And it really sucks to admit it because it really was a cool hypothesis, but it wasn't a good hypothesis. It's just not supported by any evidence we have in Old English. And if we are to analyze the language on its own terms, in its own time, the word hwæt seems to be an exclamative adverb or a sort of filler conjunction, not an interjection. What does this mean for us as scholars of Old English? Well, it means that as fun as they are, creative translations like so and bro for the first word of Old English are really just not that good. Translations like Fulk's yes and Shippey's well are much more kind of in the level of excitement that we should be sitting in. I would even go a step further and remove the punctuation entirely, translating it as one of these exclamative adverbs. How we have heard of the might of the great kings of the Spear Danes in days of yore. That said, I think it's a totally valid reading to consider it one of these filler words, so that's why I like Shippey's well most of all. And really, even though I don't think he intended it this way, Seamus Heaney's so is really not the worst way to translate that first word if that's how you're reading it. It's certainly much better than things like hark or lo. So anyway, I hate to rain on the parade, but we have to remember that in the pursuit of truth and knowledge, we must question consensus, we must look at things from new angles, and when we're presented with a body of evidence, we have to consider that evidence with clear-eyed and open-minded view, even if it's leading us to a boring conclusion. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you didn't enjoy the video and you still disagree, let me know in the comments and why. If you like content like this, be sure to check out the rest of the channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Farathie Sunday.